Hi, it's Jane from the blog chalkingupsuccess.com, and today I'm making fabric pumpkins. Here's what you're going to need to make your fabric pumpkin, and I'll list it down in the description below too. Fabric pumpkins can be made any size you want them to be, but the only thing to remember is that the width of the fabric should be at least twice as wide as the height. It's best to make a template with paper before you start. I'm making flatter pumpkins, so the measurements I used are 18 inches wide and 7 inches tall, which is 46 centimeters wide and 18 centimeters tall. But if you want to make a more rounded pumpkin, then you could make it 18 inches wide and 9 inches tall. So now that you have your fabric rectangle, fold it in half so that the right sides are together. By that I mean the pretty sides are facing each other. Put a couple of pins in each corner. That will just stop the fabric from moving around once we bring it to the sewing machine. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along the edge of the short side. It's really easy to see it here for me because my fabric is striped, and it just so happens that I have a stripe about 1/4 inch in on this fabric, so it's really quite easy to sew. Take the fabric over to the sewing machine and sew your 1/4 inch hem. And once you've done that, you just need to press the seam open with an iron, and you should be left with a tube of fabric. Next, we're going to sew a run-in stitch or baste-in stitch along one of the short edges. Thread a needle with a long length of thread, double it and make a knot in the end of it. Sew a run-in stitch about 1/4 inch down from the edge of the fabric. You're not sewing the two sides together here, you're just sewing around the single layer of fabric. So we're going to be drawing in the run-in stitch to close up the bottom of the pumpkin later. If you're new to sewing, the run-in stitch is just putting your needle in and out of the fabric in a straight line and trying to keep even stitches. Once you've arrived back to where you started, pull the thread tightly until it's completely gathered together. Hold the thread tightly with one hand and sew back and forth through the gathers quite a few times until you're sure that the gathers are really well sewn together. And then you can turn the fabric the right way out. And here you can see how it's going to look. This is going to be the bottom of the pumpkin. Next, we're going to do exactly the same on the other side. So thread your needle again, knot it, and starting from the inside this time, make the run-in stitch again all the way around until you come back to where you started. Now it's time to stuff the pumpkin. You can see my needle is still hanging here. We're just going to leave that until the very end. Start making your fabric pumpkin by adding your stuffing material and pulling the thread closed as you go. Keep adding the stuffing until you find it really hard to keep the pumpkin closed. Push the filling down and out to the sides and then add some more if there are gaps. You'll need to pack the fabric pumpkin really well before we move on to the next step. Now we're going to close up our pumpkin. Once the fabric is packed full of stuffing, pull the needle to gather up the fabric. Once the fabric is tightly gathered, hold it tightly closed with one hand whilst you sew back and forth through the gathers with your needle again. Now you have the base of your fabric pumpkin, it's time to add some definition to it. And we're going to do that by making segments. I used white cooking string for this part, but you can also use embroidery thread or cotton thread doubled up. And by the way, I was only able to use cooking string because I used my long upholstery needle for this part. If you're using a smaller needle, make sure it's one with a large eye, which will make it easier for you to thread. So, how are we going to make segments in our fabric pumpkin? To find out how much string I'm going to need, I'm wrapping it around the pumpkin around 4 times, and then I'll add a little bit extra on for good measure. If you do happen to run out of thread when you're doing this, just tie it off and then start again with some new thread. So first make a knot in the end of your thread. And then push your needle through one end of the fabric pumpkin, through the gathering, and pull it out the other end. And now you can see why using the long needle is much better for this job. Even if you're not using an upholstery needle, I really do recommend using a longer needle for this part. I'll leave a link in the description to the kind of needles you're going to need. Pull your thread down over the side of the pumpkin to the bottom and hold it tight. Bring the thread back up over the pumpkin. Pull it tightly and hold it down with your thumb while you push the needle back down again through the center of the pumpkin. Even though I'm using this long upholstery needle, it's still quite hard to push the needle through the gathers. So you can imagine how hard it would be if you were using a small needle. Now you're going to pull the thread over the top of the pumpkin again on the exact opposite side to the segment that you just made. And then you'll keep doing this until you've made 8 segments. If you're making these fabric pumpkins with a solid coloured fabric, it might be easier to do it this way instead. Make 2 segments opposite each other so that you've made a half. Then turn the pumpkin around and make another 2 segments in the opposite direction. Then you've got quarters. Split the quarters in half again to make 8 segments. By the way, if you're enjoying this tutorial, please give it a like or a thumbs up or whatever it is wherever you're watching. It really helps me. Thanks so much. Make a few stitches through the fabric to finish, and then cut your thread. I switched needles for this bit. I found it easier to use a small needle rather than my upholstery needle. But the smaller sewing needle I used had a large eye so that I could thread the cooking string through it. Next up, we're going to make a quick and easy pumpkin stem. To make my pumpkin stems, I'm using some small sticks that I found in the garden. Other things you could use to make pumpkin stems are cinnamon sticks, a piece of rolled up fabric, felt or jute, or you could save the stems of real pumpkins. Just be sure to let them completely dry out before you use them. Whatever you decide to use to make your pumpkin stem, you're going to need a glue gun for this bit. Add a small blob of hot glue to the middle of the pumpkin over the gathering and pop a small stick into the hot glue. Hold the stick in position with your hand until the hot glue is cool enough that the stick stands up by itself. Usually takes around 30 seconds. So now our pumpkins have stems, but they still look a little bit boring. I think they need to be decorated. So how do you decorate a fabric pumpkin? There are lots of ways to decorate a fabric pumpkin. You could cut out leaves from book pages or felt and glue them next to the stem. That looks nice. You could also decorate your pumpkin with dried pressed leaves. I'm decorating my first pumpkin with a tassel and some raffia and maybe some pieces of ribbon too. To make the tassel, I'm wrapping some thin string around my fingers a few times. And and I'm going to tie another piece of string around one end. And then I'm just making a little loop so that I can hang it around the pumpkin stem. Then I'm snipping the ends with the scissors. And then I'm just straightening off the ends a little bit. And my tassel is finished. I made some curly ribbon, but I didn't have any wired ribbon, so I kind of DIY'd it. And you can do this by just wrapping a short piece of ribbon around a pencil, spray it with hairspray, and let it dry. Once the ribbon is dry, pull it off the pencil and then you can arrange it however you like. I attached my ribbon to the fabric pumpkin with the glue gun again. For the second pumpkin, I wrapped a small bundle of twigs with some raffia, and I'm just going to hot glue them to the top of the pumpkin. And then maybe a little raffia bow. And that's it. Now you know how to make a fabric pumpkin. I hope you have fun crafting these autumn pumpkin decorations with all kinds of fabric. Happy crafting!